Hello, everyone. My name is Shay Pilnik. I am the proud director of the Emil and Jenny Fish Holocaust and Genocide Studies Center at Yeshiva University. I wanted to welcome you to our grandest production for the year, Jewish Responses to the Holocaust. Jewish Responses to the Holocaust is a series of 10 lectures in a variety of disciplines: history, art, theology, halakha, literature, Jewish leadership, and more. The series highlights the role played by Jews, both as communities and individuals, in the struggle to survive the murderous Nazi onslaught and retain their dignity and humanity under the most unimaginable conditions. I wanted to first of all thank my colleagues for the planning committee, Dr. Josh Karlip and Rabbi Dr. Jacob J. Schachter, who are joining us for the discussion today, and to thank our guests, Dr. David Fishman from the Jewish Theological Seminary, Dr. Sam Casso from Trinity College, Dr. Ori Scholtes from Georgetown University, Dr. Gershon Greenberg from the American University in Washington, D.C., Rabbanit Esther Farbstein from Michlala Yerushalayim, Rabbi Dr. Jacob J. Schachter from Yeshiva University, and Dr. Joshua Zimmerman from Yeshiva University. Chavi Dreyfus from Tel Aviv University and Yad Vashem is going to join us in a few minutes. I wanted to first of all ask our panelists a general question. I was trying to find the right place to begin our discussion. And I wanted to go to the ground zero. If you can see, this is the destruction of the European Jewry by Raoul Hilberg, the ground zero of Holocaust studies, one of the first historiographical works on the Holocaust published in 1961, during the same year that the Eichmann trial was taking place in Israel. And I would like to read to you the very beginning, the very first sentences of an otherwise very long, close to 800-page book. And Raoul Hilberg says, to begin with, a word should be said about the scope of this book. Lest one be misled by the word Jews in the title, let it be pointed out that this is not a book about the Jews. It is a book about the people who destroyed the Jews. Not much will be read here about the victims. The focus is placed on the perpetrators. I wanted to see who among our panelists would be curious to respond to the statement and help us understand why the study of Jewish responses to the Holocaust that came later, the book actually, Jewish Responses to the Holocaust, was published in the early 80s. Why the subject of studying the Holocaust from the perspective of the Jewish people is so important, and what is the dimension that it adds to the grander narrative of the Holocaust?
Well, I'll be glad to start.
Please, Dr. Casso.
Even though I have enormous respect for Raoul Hilberg and his scholarship, I believe that by concentrating on the point of view of the perpetrators and by basing his enormous amount of research primarily on German documents, which of course is what he set out to do. I'm not saying that he should have written a different book, but Hilberg, I think, unwillingly carries over the German view that the Jews were objects, that they were passive objects, that they had no real identity of their own. They were not legible. They were not visible. They were incapable or not seen to have produced their own culture. The Jews were people without names, without individuality, without resonance, without a past. They were just what was being discussed at various meetings. They became no more than numbers. And even though, of course, the historians who focused on perpetrator history were, of course, undertaking a very important task to understand how the machinery of destruction came about, it willy-nilly transmitted an impression of the Jews that was very wrong, and you might say somewhat perverse.
Thank you, Sam. Who else?
Might I add something, Shay?
Absolutely.
I'm adding, I'm not contradicting, I'm not disagreeing. I do think that there are reasons to concentrate on what the Nazis were about. There are reasons to understand the exterminations of diverse groups during the Holocaust at the hands of the Nazis, for example, the Roma. And there are reasons to try to look through a wide lens, both theologically, what is God about, what are humans about, and historically. But then the need to focus specifically on the Jews is in fact because as much as there were genocides before, the Armenian genocide, just to name one, and have been genocide since, and I don't have enough fingers to count the genocides between the time of the Holocaust and our own time that have ensued, there has never been an act of genocide so systematically and carefully thought out and applied. All of the apparatus of the state devoted to that, even to the extent that continuing the Holocaust when it was not in the interests in terms of materiel and manpower and so on for the German army against the Allies makes it very unique. And the double context of the manner in which this particular genocide of the Jews during the course of World War II and leading up to it, and the unique position that Jews have had over the course of history, in particular within the Christian world, going back 18 or 19 centuries, means that it offers a whole new series of levels of ways about which to think about the phenomenon of genocide in the Jewish context, both from historical and from a theological perspective.
Thank you, Ori. Any other panelists would like to interject?
Yes,
Gershon.
Gershon, thank you.
And then Rabbi Schachter, yes.
Yes, I would go further than either one. And I remember going to a German history conference, and there were papers about how the Nazis spent their vacations and how they swam, how they used a toothpaste. And I sat there, and at that point, I came to the, I guess, rash conclusion that the entire focus on Nazism and World War II as part of German history amounted to a tacit posthumous victory of Nazism. The fascination with that was an extension of the overwhelming force of Hitlerian Germany. So that's point one. Point two, if we're talking about the Holocaust, we're talking about what happened to the Jews. You want to talk about World War II? Please. But the Holocaust is a Jewish phenomenon. The word came out of Judaism with regard to this. Third, that indeed, as Sam Casso said, this idea of making the Jews the object, and from the perspective of believing Jewry, the Nazis were the object in a drama scripted by God. And lastly, we can begin, I think, what Rabbanit Farbstein said at the very beginning is something with which I identify. She spoke of the narrative of the Holocaust and the need to move Judaism, and Judaism in its own term, as Rabbanit Farbstein said, to the lev shel hanarativ, which was translated into the center. But either way, I think that our task is major, because we have to lift Judaism from out of the shadow of this triumphalist view of history and put it into the center of the Holocaust where it belongs.
Thank you, Rabbi Schachter. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I want to begin by thanking Emil and Jenny Fish very much for enabling Yeshiva University to have such an extraordinary new center that has already made major contributions, and acknowledge the great work of Professor Shay Pilnik, who's our leader and director,
Thank you.
and having undertaken this task and have acquitted yourself so far, and please God in the future with great dignity and distinction. It's a privilege to be here with distinguished panelists whose work I have read and studied for many, many years. I'm honored to be included in this group. And on behalf of Yeshiva University, I want to thank those of you who are not affiliated with our university for accepting Professor Pilnik's invitation to join us on this very important 2 days conference and panel. I think the Holocaust is important for Jews because it's part of the Jewish historical experience. Thank God, we've shied away from the famous lachrymose conception of the Jews formulated by the late Professor Sela Baron. But at the same time, there's no question that tragedy and challenge has been a fundamental part of the Jewish historical experience, certainly culminating in the Holocaust, and therefore it's extremely important for us to be able to focus on this. And particularly, I want to commend Rabbanit Farbstein and Professor Greenberg for the tremendous amount of work that they've done, particularly in underscoring the religious responses, something that has been overlooked for many, many, many years. This is also an important part of our collective Jewish experience. And so I thank all of you for your contributions, and there's no doubt in my mind that this is fundamentally important for us as a people and part of our narrative, and needs to be underscored and further developed.
Rabbi Schachter, thank you. When you speak about the conference, the 2-day conference, I wanted to remind our audience that it is virtual. It is actually accessible through our YouTube channel, and the YouTube channel is accessible through our website. I would like to welcome you all to go later to www.yu.edu/fish-center. I'm going to actually type it up in the chat soon, and to encourage you to go to our website. So we aired five lectures last Sunday and additional 5 lectures today. And I would like to now starting to address some individual questions to our guests. Dr. Zimmerman, did you want to say something? I saw. Okay.
No, I just want to thank you for including me in the panel and all the distinguished panelists. Only just to make a comment on what was being said, starting with Raoul Hilberg's book, and kind of there was a discussion about the Holocaust and its uniqueness. And I would just say that one of the challenges is to discuss and try to show kind of the world why the Holocaust is distinguished and unique from the concept of genocide. And I think among Jews, it's an automatic assumption, but I find as I venture out and lecture to non-Jews, that is not at all assumed or understood. And I've encountered a lot of resistance to that idea that the Holocaust is in any way unique from other genocides. And so I feel like Yehuda Bauer's 2003 book, Rethinking the Holocaust, in which he distinguishes the two terms as an important point of departure, which is genocide as partial annihilation, referring to genocides, and then the Holocaust as the concept of total annihilation as a concept. And I feel like that's an important, project, I think, to teach.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I wanted to start going through the different lectures and speaking to our panelists. I also wanted to welcome Dr. Chavi Dreyfus from Tel Aviv University and from Yad Vashem, who joined us a couple of minutes ago. And I would like to start with Rabbanit Farbstein. Your lecture is based on the book Hidden by Thunder, Beseter Am, but also the Forgotten Memoirs. It's a lecture about the memoirs and diaries by rabbis. I'm trying to, again, go back from a point of departure that would be familiar to our average audience. Everyone is familiar in America with the diary of Anne Frank. It's a diary of an individual Jew, a girl, who is absolutely not representative of the majority of Jews who fell under the yoke of Nazism. She was a Western Jew. She came originally from Germany. She came from a very assimilated background. And I'm surprised that the diaries, by comparison, of rabbis, leaders of great communities, that's how you begin your lecture, become known only in the 1990s. So how do we explain these decades of silence? And how do we explain the fact that this whole subject that you studies had been before so much forgotten? I mean, that's the title of the book, or marginalized. Please unmute yourself. Rabbanit Farbstein, you have to unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Excuse me.
Wonderful.
Okay, you didn't send me this question before, so I couldn't, write it in English. So I'll try, to be spontaneous, but excuse my English. And if I have some problem, I'll go back to Hebrew.
Your English is great. Yeah.
First minute. Okay, we can say that the reasons that a lot of religious people used to say, Yad Vashem didn't like it, and the Zionists didn't like it, and so they wanted to speak only about physical heroism and so on. I really don't think that this is the main reason. I think that the main reason was that no one of the Orthodox community or even religious community dealt with this, because these documents demands much more knowledge about Yahadut, about Hebrew, about reading in between the lines, and you have to make a big and deep reading and learning. You have to know both Historia and Judaism. And I think that we are the reason why it wasn't done before. So of course, if we would have more help from the organization Yad Vashem, it would be easier. But the fact is that the religious community came to research the Holocaust from the 80s or 90s. Of course, there were before people like Dr. Zimmerman and Moshe Prager and Dan Michman that brought the subject to the academy, but not research. So it's both sides. I can say that without help of organization around, like Claim Conference and other, we couldn't do it because it's a long and very, very difficult work to find the material, to explain it, to make them accessible, and to write about them. And maybe those are the reasons. I'm against the claims that people didn't want, because I can see that when we write it in the right way, when we speak to people, even non-religious, with documents, and they can see that we know history, they want to hear. And that's why I reach you for the centers that you build. And I hope it will be like that in America, in the United States.
Rabbanit Farbstein, I wanted to apologize for putting you on the spot, but your English is terrific and you do such a great job when you respond spontaneously. I wanted to move to Rabbi Schachter. Both Rabbanit Farbstein, Rabbi Schachter's lecture, Dr. Greenberg's lecture concerned issues of rabbinics, theology. Rabbi Schachter, you mentioned Emil Fackenheim's 614th commandment, that we are all after the Holocaust forbidden to give Hitler any posthumous victory. And you shared a very powerful story. I know it's a personal story, the story of your father as a 27-year-old, the Rabbi of Buchenwald. I will make a parenthetical comment that the book, The Rabbi of Buchenwald, is about to be published. He was a US chaplain who liberated the camps, who liberated Buchenwald on April 11th, for those of you who don't know, in 1945. And during a sermon, so the story goes, there is a person from the very back. Rabbi Schachter, maybe you can continue the story before I will ask you the question. What did the person from the very back of the shul yell at your father?
Thank you, Dr. Pilnik. I'll try to be very brief. As you mentioned, my late father, Zichrono Livracha, Rabbi Herschel Schachter, was the first American Jewish chaplain to enter concentration camps. He came into Buchenwald, and shortly after his arrival, he organized a tefillah service for the survivors and for American soldiers. This was the first service that was held in Buchenwald, and there were hundreds of people there. My father told me this story many, many times, and I have no doubt that many of you panelists and guests today have seen an iconic picture of that service in Yad Vashem on the way out towards the end of the exhibit. It occupies an entire wall. And my father told me that he was leading the service. You can only imagine how the survivors were overwhelmed. They got up to the recital of Kaddish. People were bawling. It was overwhelming, overwhelming. And then in the back, somebody yelled out in Yiddish, and I'll say it in Yiddish and I'll translate it. And he screamed out and he said, "En zu welcher Gott davenst die? So the God was hat reingeworfen dein Mama and Tate in crematoria? To which God are you praying? To the God who threw your mother and father into the crematorium?" And everybody was silent. Absolute shock, silence. My father's 27 years old. He's trying to inspire these incredible Jews who went through hell. And now somebody yells out and disrupts the service, and he didn't know what to do. He told me that he stopped for a moment. He collected himself. Everybody is watching him. Hundreds of pairs of eyes. He leaves the bima where he was standing in the front. He walks to the back. He extends his hand. He finds the person. He gives the person a hug. And he just holds on to him and doesn't say a word. Seemed like it was a minute. It probably was 10 seconds. This person calmed down. My father put his hands down. He turned, went back, and continued the tefillah, the service. That was the story that I told, illustrating part of the lecture that I hope that you will all listen to, and listen to all of the other lectures, extraordinary lectures that have been delivered as part of this conference.
So Rabbi Schachter, how do you place the reaction of this man who screamed in Yiddish through the lens of Emil Feckenheim's 614th commandment? You divide your lecture into three parts: those who reject tradition, those who challenge, those who reject tradition and God, those who challenge God, and those who embrace him wholeheartedly and embrace the tradition and would like to continue to adhere to it. How easy is it to categorize each individual response?
I think it's possible to categorize a continuum of belief in God and maintaining one's belief in God as the Holocaust was unfolding and after the Holocaust. And this is a very, very important subject. How does it fit into Emil Feckenheim's 614th commandment, and that is not to give Hitler a posthumous victory? It's hard for me to say. Feckenheim himself starts off by saying that one needs to maintain one's Jewishness. And then he goes on in this passage to also talk about maintaining one's faith. It's very hard for me to say, and I learned this from my father, Zichrono Livracha. It's very hard for me to say that someone who lost their faith is guilty of violating the 614th commandment. For me, it's important for people to continue to maintain their connection to the Jewish people, to continue to be able to hitch their wagon to the caravan of Jewish destiny. My father taught me, a man of deep, deep faith who saw the worst. When he came in, he saw the crematoria. He saw the smoke. He described it. He taught me never to judge. You cannot judge someone who lost their faith. If they maintain their faith, they are Kiddoshei Elyon, unbelievable. And Rabbanit Farbstein has devoted her life to draw attention to this as a central element of the Shoah experience. And we are all standing on her shoulders. I have the highest respect, but I cannot say in good conscience, I don't know what I would have done. I cannot say that someone who rejected their faith is mufka, is outside of the perspective of Jewish life and Jewish tradition. And the point that I made in this lecture, and with this I conclude, is that this gentleman stayed in the room. He didn't have to come into the room to begin with. Most of the Jews, my father told me, were milling around. They were totally irrelevant and uninterested. They knew there was a service, but it wasn't for them. They were done. It was over. He came in and he stayed and he screamed from within the tefillah. And after my father gave him a hug, he stayed. He is a hero as far as I'm concerned. To me, Jews who survived the Holocaust and continue to maintain a connection to Jewishness and to the Jewish people are heroes.
Could I just say something?
Yes.
Fackenheim himself did not go through the Shoah. And his 614th commandment is brilliant. The formulation, it's 4 parts, it's brilliant. But he takes it to a point where I feel like, how dare he who did not go through the hell they went through, presume to accuse those who, unlike those whom Rabbi Schachter so eloquently just described, who could maintain their faith, but those who could not, how dare he judge them? And that's what I find as the flaw in his formulation, not the formulation, but then the way he then applies it in the book that continues his discussion of it, to condemn those who lost their faith, to accuse them of giving Hitler posthumous victories.
So I'm so glad that you raised that. I know, Shay, just a quick response,
please.
And that is,
I'm
what
watching
would you say those who lost their faith or never had their faith, but continued to maintain a fealty to Jewishness and to Jewish life, who came to Israel, who helped build the state of Israel, who did hitch their wagon to the destiny of the Jewish people, even if it was not through the lens of faith?
No, I think that's spectacular. I agree with you, spectacular.
Okay.
But for those who could not and did not, I would not
understand that, but I prefer to understand.
I get it, and I applaud your point completely.
Okay.
Yes.
I see Fackenheim defensible from this broader perspective.
Okay.
That's how I internalize that.
Understood.
Thank you for your
I just every
got
time I've read and taught that book, I get angry at his judgment.
I appreciate what you're saying.
Yeah.
I wonder if somebody ever asked him this and challenged him when he was alive. Okay, but Bakasha, Professor.
Thank you. We're going to go back to the destruction of European Jewry, Raoul Hilberg. I'm not surprised that you, Dr. Greenberg, had to respond to the flawed way in which the Holocaust is introduced, rather than a story of World War II. But the Holocaust as a term, as a concept, is introduced by Raoul Hilberg. I have to say, Dr. Greenberg, I found your lecture transformative. When you and I had a conversation before the lecture, I recall two things I learned from you. One is that the term Holocaust, and we understand to what degree the term Holocaust coming from the Septuagint, from the book of the book of Leviticus as a burnt offering, would be a misnomer to describe the Holocaust. But one thing I learned from you, the Holocaust is a term that originated actually from the Jewish tradition, from a conference of Orthodox rabbis in the United States. I would like to ask you in a moment to respond to that. And the other thing is, I recall when we talked about this project, and I insisted that Jewish responses to the Holocaust is the study of the Holocaust through the lens of the victims. And you said, Shai, I have to say that the term victim here itself is going to be maybe a misnomer, and not the right term to describe how the experience of the Holocaust felt from the point of view of the Jews. So, Dr. Greenberg, how do you respond to that, to this compliment? And we can't hear you. You always have to unmute yourself. That's going to be my job here. Dr. Greenberg, you have to unmute yourself. Yep. There you go.
Yes, I could say that I can take compliments, but I don't inhale. Okay. Let me respond by going back a little. That what Rabbanit Esther Farbstein quoted at the end of her address touched me deeply, because on a personal level, because she quoted a cousin of my wife, Erica Weinfeld. Esther was quoting Abraham Weinfeld, "Ve'ulai haya lo chesed, אולי היה זה חסד השם יתברך, שכנגד הצרות והייסורים בגשמיוס, היטיב והרחיב לנו קצת ברוחניות." That perhaps it was the benevolence of God that over against the materialistic suffering, he intensified and increased our spirituality. And this underlies what I was after, that indeed this happened in terms of theology and religious thought. This spirituality manifests itself in what I called this meta-history. Jewish thinkers were able to step back from the impossible empirical world and find and ground their feet, their legs, in a spiritual realm. And first they protested, and they were silent. But after that border, they went in and they were able to think about it. Now, these people who wrote these texts left us nothing less than sacred writings, because sacred writings constitute the literature which connect us to the sacred and to God. And because of these people, the Jewish people were able to maintain that relationship to God. Even after they left the Holocaust and looked back on it, they were able to maintain it. So I think we have to really try to put aside all the negations, all the absence, all the indifference to it, and look to the positive responses and the protesting responses, which are an entree to the positive responses. Just to say about Emil Fackenheim, for example, his writings, something I went into, I knew him very well, he was a dear friend. His writings and his thinking you can find within the Holocaust itself. So there was this continuity, and that's what I'm getting at. As far as the term Holocaust is concerned, yes, it's because Eliezer Silver wrote Churban and Katastrophe, and it was immediately translated into Holocaust. And my entry, I'll tell you later, into this study came because he happened to be the husband of my Aunt Pearl. That's the way in which I would like to respond to your question, because I want to also to get back to what Ori said and what Rabbi Schachter said. Thank you.
And the term Holocaust was coined by him during the war.
In 1942, it came out, and as you said, a rabbinical conference in Belmont, New Jersey, and immediately he used Churban and Katastrophe, and immediately it was translated into English in the press as the word Holocaust, and that's already responding to the to the murdering that was going on in Europe. But I don't think it's a world-shattering thing that happened. It's just that I wanted to emphasize the point that the Holocaust is a Jewish phenomenon.
And that's a very important point. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Greenberg. I would like to now move to another subject. Culture as a form of resistance, culture as a vehicle of subversion, the subversion of the Nazi plan to destroy both the Jews and their civilization. And I have a question for Mori Rabbi, Dr. David Fishman from the Jewish Theological Seminary. Thank you for being with us. Your lecture is about your recent book, The Book Smugglers, about the Papir Brigade, or the Paper Brigade, the group of Jews who, as inmates in the Vilna ghetto, were busy rescuing thousands of Jewish textual treasures during the war, rescuing them from the claws of Nazis, who paradoxically were trying to study the Jews for their own, in order to justify their own particular racial ideology. Dr. Fishman, you made a statement there in the lecture about the work of the Paper Brigade as an existential statement. And I was wondering if we can flesh it out a little bit. Why was the work of Sutzkever, Kaczerginsky, Rachela Krinsky an act of existential, was it an existential statement?
Thank you, Shai. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm enjoying listening to this conversation. Maybe the way I'll start my response is to say these people were the whole spectrum of Jewish intellectuals in the Vilna ghetto, from Jewish communists down to Orthodox believers and everything in between, Zionists, Bundists, etc. But they all shared, I'll build on what was said till now, a kind of faith. It wasn't necessarily a religious faith, but it was a faith that the Jewish people needs and will need in the future its cultural heritage. It will need its books. It will need its manuscripts. It will need its historical documents, and that this was of supreme importance. It's not just a matter of saving Jewish bodies, though they were very involved in that too, but it is about saving the Jewish spirit as represented by these books, these manuscripts. So they were all engaged, and that was an act of faith. I mean, no one in the Vilna ghetto could be sure if there would actually be a Jewish people after what was going on after the war, and but they believed, they didn't expect themselves to survive. Let me get now to your question as you formulated it. Existential statement. They wanted to connect the remainder of their lives, which they thought was very short, and probably their death, with something that was of ultimate importance. And that's something that they thought was of ultimate importance was rescuing Jewish cultural heritage. In other words, that was eternal. Again, it didn't even matter what ideology they ascribed to, but they all believed Jewish cultural heritage must remain forever, and we won't let it be destroyed. So it's an existential statement in the sense of, I'm going to tell you what my life means, what my life stands for, and what I'm willing to die for. And so that, in that sense, what they did was an existential statement.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Scholtes, how do you respond to my attempt to frame the art created during the Holocaust, the subject of your lecture, as a subversive act, as an act of resistance?
I guess I would look at it that way from two different perspectives. The mere fact of creating in the context, because we're using the term in Holocaust visual art today, and in my lecture at your behest, to limit ourselves to work done during the Holocaust as opposed to that which was done afterwards. because that broadens things out in other ways as well. But as far as the work being done during the Holocaust, I would say it can be considered subversive in two different ways. One, the mere fact of creating in the midst of all that destruction. And one thinks in particular, of course, of what was happening among the children in Theresienstadt, who were being encouraged to be children, who were being encouraged to create, and whose art is an unparalleled legacy, both of reflection on what's happening, and even more so, on reflection as if what's happening is not happening, because they produce work that is beautiful in spite of the ugliness that is around them. So that is an act of subversion inherently. The human spirit that can be creative, the Jewish spirit, to build on what David Fishman was just saying, the Jewish spirit that has been so creative for so long in so many different directions, textual to be sure, but visual, musical, when those opportunities were available as well. In no directions have we not been creative when the opportunity has afforded itself. So all of that, following that, doing that is subversive. But secondly, of course, there were groups who were part of a deliberate, intended subversion in a very conscious, direct way. So we have works of art that are marked by those little V's, for example, that comes out of that work. And I would say one last thing, that one also has to divide that kind of direct and indirect subversion between a phenomenon that is part of a group effort. And there's a certain sense in which we can look, for example, at Theresienstadt that way, at Terezin that way. But then there are also individuals who are not within that context who are managing to make art, such as Felix Nussbaum, or such as Charlotte Solomon, who are isolated, who are not surrounded by their fellow Jews, who are producing art. I don't think they're thinking of it as subversion, but it is subversive because they are continuing to be art and to do art, to be creative and to do creative in spite of the destruction which is all around them.
Thank you. I felt that even the Bruno Schulz painting on the children's wall of, I believe, images from the brothers Grimm.
And indeed,
say something about, can also be seen as subversive, right?
And absolutely, terrifically ironic, right? He is surviving until he's gunned down because a Nazi officer somehow has gotten a hold of the fact that this guy does art. And so he brings him into his house, and of all things, he's doing wall paintings for this Nazi officer's child's nursery. And he has all of these fairy tales, but they're all just a bit twisted. There's something, to use your word, subversive about them. One could say of Grimm's fairy tales that they're grim in many respects, but he emphasizes, whether they're grim or not, the grimness of them, as opposed to their being simply lighthearted and joyful. So I agree with you absolutely, Shay. There was something particularly subversive about Bruno Schulz's work in that context. Yeah.
Thank you, Ori. And let me mention another irony. I want to move now to Eufen Scheidweg at the Crossroads, which is a journal. Here now we're dealing with Jewish intellectual responses to the Holocaust, a journal published by Jewish intellectuals in Eastern Europe, right before the outbreak of World War II in September 1st of 1939. Eufen Scheidweg, or At the Crossroads, is reminiscent of Al Parashat Drachim by Ahad Ha'am, one of the greatest ideological and cultural figures of the Zionist movement. Dr. Karlip, I have to say that when I read Parashat Drachim in high school, Al Parashat Drachim in high school, I could understand why Ahad Ha'am is talking about a certain crossroads that the Jewish people come to and needs to choose between different directions. But here what I see when I was listening to your lecture about Eufen Scheidweg is more a reflection of a dead end, of a group of people who are now looking back at the different Jewish ideologies of Eastern European Jewry that failed, and in a prophetic way already see the doom of Jewish civilization before the outbreak of the war. So how would you respond to that? And unmute, yes.
Yes, am I unmuted?
You are.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Shay. First of all, thank you, Shay, for organizing this wonderful conference and for the panel. It was a real pleasure and honor to be on the steering committee with you and with Rabbi J.J. Schachter. I also want to say that it's an honor to share the panel with my esteemed teachers, with David Fishman, who was my advisor at JTS, and to Sam Cassell, who played a very important role in my intellectual development in graduate school and beyond, and to David Roskis, who's not on the panel, but who actually said in his book Against the Apocalypse that No Exit would have been a more appropriate title than At the Crossroads, that I've been shading.
And his lecture is a part of our series on the Jewish anthological mind. Yes.
Yes. So just to answer your question, there were several reviews of Affen Shadvek that I discuss hopefully by the end of the year, at the end of 2021, the first volume of Affen Shadvek, a critical edition with a full English translation and an introduction will be out through the German Institute Academy project of the Dubnov Institute, and that I'm editing. And as part of the introduction, I looked at some of the reviews, and Yankov Lischinski, who was a Yiddishist and a demographer and an economist very involved in YIVO, wrote a review, several articles about it, and he contrasted Al Parshat Derachim of Achad Ha'am from 40 years before to Affen Shadvek in 1939, and he said exactly what you said, that the Jewish world was brimming with possibilities at the turn of the century, and Achad Ha'am was discussing a transformation of Jewish identity, from religious identity to cultural nationalist identity, and which direction Jewish cultural nationalism would go in. And in contrast, Affen Shadvek talked about, as you said, a dead end, that Elio Cherikover and Yisrael Efroikin and Zelig Kalmanovich and Avram Menis and all the people Avram Golem, all the people who are writing in Affen Shadvek in different ways are saying all the new ideologies, the secular national ideologies, particularly Yiddishism and diaspora nationalism, because that's where they were coming from, but also some of the other ideologies have come to a dead end. Assimilation has won despite its ideological obsolescence, despite the fact that we're living in an age of counter-emancipation, and the decades of assimilation have robbed us of our cultural response, of our ability to forge a strong cultural response as our religious forebears had done. So that was their perspective. But I'll just say, in terms of your question, that there's a certain irony in that, looking back 80 years, and that is that, of course, Affen Shadvek was the inauguration of a robust cultural response to the Holocaust, to the beginning of what we now call the Holocaust, that was continued in the ghettos, in the Warsaw Ghetto and the Vilna Ghetto. So much of we can see that much of that response in the books of Sam Cassell and David Fishman. Sam Cassell talks about the 2.5 years project, where there was a questionnaire about life in the Warsaw Ghetto, and you have a lot of the intellectuals saying the same things that were said in 1939 in Affen Shadvek, including Hillel Zeitlin, who also wrote for Affen Shadvek. David Fishman wrote about Zelig Kalmanovich and his activity in the ghetto, and this attempt of saving cultural treasures. The fact is that when we look from 80 years, 80 years in hindsight at Affen Shadvek, we see a response of a generation of Jewish intellectuals who lived at the crossroads, to use their own term, between text and context. On the one hand, these were secular intellectuals who were extremely involved in what's going on in Europe and in European politics and culture. They're all fluent in Russian and in multiple European languages. On the other hand, their essays are replete with Talmudic and biblical quotations. And in fact, many of them use meta-histories. Gershon Greenberg mentioned meta-histories. Many of them use very traditional rabbinic meta-histories to understand the ensuing catastrophe. And so I think that Alvin Shavik itself is a good metaphor for not only a response to the ensuing catastrophe, but also from hindsight, all that we've lost in the Jewish world. The fact, I end my introduction by saying that today we would be hard pressed to find anybody who could respond, who could combine all the text and context that they combine in one person very reflexively. People who understand the historical context don't really, most of the time, don't understand the religious context, and vice versa, and certainly couldn't carry over that religious context to a Jewish cultural, secular cultural context. So that would be how I would respond.
Thank you, Dr. Karlip. Before we move to the next subject, I wanted to invite our guests to both in the Zoom room. We also have guests joining us on Facebook Live to address questions to our panelists in the chat room. We'll have about 15 minutes towards the end of the panel to take questions from our audience, but I would like to encourage you to do so. Our next topic is life in the largest ghettos, primarily Warsaw, but maybe we will get a chance to talk about the large ghetto as well. Dr. Josh Zimmerman, my colleague from Yeshiva University, thank you for being with us today. I wanted to share with you a reflection while I was listening to your lecture about the Polish underground and the Jews. My initial reaction that was maybe your lecture could be or should be perfectly linked to a different series on Polish responses to the Holocaust. But as I was watching it, I realized that the boundaries between the Jewish and the Polish identity, that these boundaries are actually fairly porous, that it's not that easy when we talk about Jewish responses to the Holocaust to determine who is a Jew and who is a Pole. Maybe you can share with us some examples of how that porous boundary plays itself out both in your lecture and in your research.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be part of this panel discussion. So in my case, what I would say is that the Polish and Jewish identities in interwar Poland were quite fluid, because in the 20-year period of the Second Polish Republic, lots of Jews began to become adopting or to adopt Polish national identity, and several of them thought of themselves as Poles of Jewish background, or Jews by religion, Polish by nationality. And in my book, you can see how this is borne out, where under Nazi occupation they are divided into two racial groups. And I give some examples of Poles of Jewish background who fought in the who fought in the general resistance movement, but under Nazi law were fully Jewish by race. I give the example of Stanislav Likiernik, one who had 4 Jewish grandparents, and both of his parents were born Jewish, but right before they married in around 1920, both of them converted. Afterwards, they had children, and Mr. Likiernik was raised in this Catholic family, but had Jewish relatives all around him. And when the war started, he did enter the resistance movement, but at that point, he was, of course, by Nazi law, fully Jewish. So he was considered Jewish in the underground, and he actually had a code name of Mordechai, and fought in that resistance movement really in a way as a Jew, because that's the way he was defined. And I talk about in the book about how I was able to interview this gentleman and that in the course of writing the book, I put him in the section of the book which was about Jews in the Polish resistance. And even in the bibliography, I separate the memoirs, and one class of memoirs is Jews in the Polish resistance movement, and his autobiography is in there. Then after the book was published, I got a note from his granddaughter that Mr. Lick-Yernick was quite upset about how he was presented, quite simply because, as apparently through his granddaughter explained, he does not regard himself as Jewish, and why did I call him a Jewish member of the resistance movement? So I responded to the granddaughter and said, in a revised edition, I would refer to him as a Pole of Jewish background, and he said that that was all right. And in fact, in 2017, the revised edition did come out, and he actually passed away, unfortunately, a year later. But I understood from his granddaughter that he was satisfied. But I found it interesting also that in a Polish language review of my book, one reviewer expressed actual kind of outrage that I would refer to him as a Jewish member of the resistance movement. So I was trying to kind of navigate this kind of like minefield of controversies, figuring out why did this bring up so much by just calling this one particular figure a Jew, when of course he had to go into hiding during the entire war as a Jew and was defined as a Jew, and was understood in that way, even though, and we have this unusual situation, even though he was born Catholic, was a practicing Catholic, but we had this, and he himself had to wrestle with these different identities, fully identifying as a person of Jewish background, but not religiously Jewish. So this is just one of the categories that I discuss in my book, and partly in response to the perception in the literature when I started my research that there were no Jews in the Polish resistance movement because of anti-Semitism. And so I fully took that as verified because of the literature on this topic when I started the research. But then more and more, I started coming across Jews in the underground, that was the Polish underground, and was able to reach out to them and conduct interviews with them. And it was really these figures that presented the conundrum of this identity: Polish, Jewish, Jewish, Polish, Poles of Jewish background. You also had a couple of cases, for me, that was very important, which is Yiddish-speaking Jews from Warsaw who were journalists in the Yiddish press, raised in Jewish families, of course, but fully regarded themselves as Poles by nationality. And I think, to me, this is counter to the assumption that a Yiddish-speaking Jewish intellectual in Poland would automatically regard himself or herself as Jewish by nationality. And we see that that's actually not always the case. So that's some of the issues that I addressed in the book.
Thank you, Dr. Zimmerman. Since this is a more general topic, I wanted to see if anyone wanted to respond when we talk about Jewish responses to the Holocaust. Can we really look at Jews as one clear religious, ethnic, and sociological entity? If we can't, I would suppose that the term Jewish responses would make much less sense, maybe little sense. Does anyone want to off the bat?
It seems to me, Shay, that it goes back to the problem that attaches itself to defining what Judaism is from the beginning of the 19th century, which is to say, are we a religion? Are we a culture? Are we a body of customs and traditions? By the late 19th century, there are many who are thinking of us as a nationality. Thanks to Wilhelm Marr and others, we're being thought of as an ethnicity or race. By the time we get to Mordechai Kaplan, we're a civilization, all of which apply in different ways, all of which can work, none of which can be the exclusive definition of what we are. So the only way that we can say, okay, this is what Jews are, is if we assume the position, and this brings us all the way back to the very beginning and your quote from Hilberg and the initial response to that quote, which is that, yes, we can take the Nazi perspective. And if we do that, then, as you know, all I need is one Jewish grandparent for me to qualify for a one-way ticket to Auschwitz. And I wonder, Josh, if the level of discomfort and outrage on the part of some of the reviewers and in Poland was because they still remember the danger of being classified as a Jew, even though, my God, I grew up as a Catholic and I'm a practicing Catholic, that part of it was a kind of an emotional response to that, rather than per se to the way you happen to be categorizing them in your work.
Well, I would agree with you that of course, for a Jew in hiding in Nazi-occupied Europe, that term was a death sentence, right? So after the war, it had a certain meaning. I wanted to share with you one case in which a Jewish child in hiding during the war in Poland, both her parents perished. She was placed in a home with a false baptismal certificate and false identity papers, but because her parents perished, that Polish family raised her after the war. And somewhere around 1956, a cousin tracked her down and came from Israel and introduced himself and revealed to her at that moment that she's her story, and she describes it in her memoirs as being quite angry at this person for revealing this, for this tectonic shift in her understanding of who she is and her life. And she denied it for a while, but ends up reaching out to that family, making Aliyah, and then becoming actually a religious Shomer Shabbat, Shomer Mitzvot, a Jew in Israel. So that, like you're saying, that the first notion that she was a Jew outraged her when she was, in her late teens in Poland. So I see exactly what you're saying.
And there was just a chat question from Marvin Tick.
We will take we will take chat questions later, but go ahead.
No, but it was I was thinking about the movie.
Yes,
I think it was called The Last Jews in Portugal. I'm forgetting. It was the discovery that came about in the 1920s of this many generations of Marranos, and they're a film, but this is in the 1960s, and they're making matzot right before Pesach, and there's a knock on the door, and you see the terror in their faces, even though we're talking about the 1960s, as if they think they're in the 1560s, and it's the Inquisition knocking at the door that's going to find they're making matzah. So this kind of thing, I would think, in our emotions and in our psyches, can remain for a long time.
Did I hear a comment by, is it Dr. Dreyfus?
Yes, first of all, I apologize for joining only late.
Oh, good evening, no worries, but we can see you. Do we have a camera?
You can't see me? It seems as if my camera should be working and I see myself.
It does. It is working right now. Good evening, Javi. Thank you for being with us.
Good evening, Dr. Pilnik, and thank you to all the speakers. I apologize for not being able to hear the beginning, but I wanted to join the conversation in a few aspects. First of all, for your latest questions about Jewish resistance, I think this is really a basic question when we're talking about the Holocaust, because the question is it Jewish resistance or is it a resistance done by Jews? For example, if we're looking at the underground that operated in Algiers during the war, which was made out mainly of Jews, but communist Jews, and when they were asked after the war, they themselves didn't see their act as something Jewish, but as something communist, Georges Albuquerque and others. Another example that I can give here is the communist underground that attacked train number 20 in Belgium that was bringing Jews towards Auschwitz on the 19th of April 1943, train number 20. So it consisted of Jews and non-Jews. The non-Jews got the title righteous among the nation, but the communist Jews were not recognized as such. So is it Jewish resistance or is it resistance by Jews? And another question, or another example, which could be even prior to that, is a story of Wilfried Israel, who helped Jews emigrate in the 30s from Nazi Germany, when there was no final solution yet. So is this something that should be seen as resistance or not? I think that this question of reaction, of Jewish reaction, is much more complicated. And just as today we don't talk about one Jewish leadership, and we talk about many different aspects, formal, informal, I think that this topic of reactions, of Jewish reactions or Jewish resistance, is much more complicated. So this is one thing. Another thing, I apologize for missing the beginning, but understand that there was some kind of a discussion about the uniqueness of the Holocaust. Since I don't know what was said, I just want to add one thing, and at least I am not talking so much about the uniqueness of the Holocaust, but using the term of Professor Bauer of an unprecedented event, because any historical event is unique. And then when we're talking about Holocaust and genocide, and a genocide, of course, is an important context, not the only one, but an important context talking about the Holocaust, of course, there are some unique aspects, but that is true to any historical event. And we can talk about the views of Yehuda Bauer, who talks about the Holocaust as an unprecedented and the most radical genocide done until now. Or we can talk about the perspective of Dan Michman, who is talking about some aspects which were in the Holocaust and we cannot see them in other places. For example, the fact that the Germans were not only trying to murder the Jews, but also to murder what they call the Jewish spirit. So I would try to put much more question marks in this discussion. And the last thing that I want to say is, just since I heard dear Rabbanit Farbstein saying that those sources were always there and she haven't done anything. So I want to say that what of course was mentioned before, that this is not really correct, since none of us historians were aware of those ultra-Orthodox sources before the impressive work done by Rabbanit Farbstein and the Michlala. And the fact that today we managed to refer to the actions of this public, of ultra-Orthodox, regarding resistance or any other thing, is also very much connected to her work here. So those were just a few things I wanted to say, and I'm sorry for joining you only late.
Javi, let's stay with you. Actually, Dr. Casso was next, but we can flip the order.
No, please go to him. I'll wait patiently.
I will go to him. We'll have time for that. But since we talked about the ultra-Orthodox dimension that was missing, I was curious, your book, Hasof, the end, describing the end of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, looks at the uprising as the resistance not of the Job, the Jewish fighting organization, a group of 750, if I'm right, a few hundred fighters. There was also another military union there associated with Betar, but rather looking at it as a collective effort. And I wanted to ask you, of course, when we as Jews look at the Warsaw Ghetto uprising as a collective effort, I'm sure that it is a very uplifting and inspiring view. To what degree does that correspond to the reality? And I'm also curious if there were groups in the Warsaw Ghetto who thought that staging an uprising, even in the spring of 1943, would be counterproductive, dangerous, something that no Jewish individuals or groups should pursue.
Okay, so thank you, Shay, for those two questions. First of all, I want to say, and this is my own perspective, of course, is I think that there are not many events during the Holocaust that we can refer to them as uplifting. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising and the destruction of the Jewish life within the ghetto was a disaster. And the fact that those Jews managed to fight the Germans by weapon and by disobeying the German orders is of course inspiring for us, but it was a total brutality that we should refer to.
I stand corrected. Thank you.
So this is one thing. The fact that it, of course, that it is until today an important symbol for the spirit of for the human spirit and so on. It's important, but when I hear, and you can hear it from time to time, people talking about how there was this victory or that, there are not so many victories in the Holocaust, and we should put, I think, those things in perspective, and those glimpses of actions which are important cannot change the disaster that happened to the Jewish people in those times. So that is one thing. Regarding your next question about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, it is not that Mordechai Levitch, the head of the JOB, the Jewish Fighting Organization, or Pavel Frenkel, the head of the Zhezhevul, stood in the ghetto, in the middle of the ghetto, and said, listen, guys, the Germans will enter, let's go and fight them by this way or that way. And the fact that today we look at things and understand that this is when the Warsaw Ghetto uprising started, this is something that we look from our perspective. From their perspective, things looked very much different. Nobody knew that when the Germans will find themselves facing resistance by arms or by disobeyment, they will just set the whole ghetto by fire. And nobody thought that this will be the way that they will fight the Jews. So during the war, saying somebody saying, oh, this is not what should be done, I didn't meet anything like that. I did meet things, sounds like that, which actually are heard more and more today. People saying, oh, because of the uprisings, this is why the Germans set the ghetto on fire. But again, if we look what happened to the Jews who were deported from Warsaw to the camps in Lublin and later are murdered, 42,000 of them on November 1943, we understand that the blame is on the Germans and not on others. So I hope this is a partial answer to your question.
Thank you. Thank you. It's more than a partial answer. Dr. Casso, at the beginning of my conversation, I mentioned the paradigm of the 614th commandment by Emil Feckenheim. I want to conjure up another very common concept among both Holocaust study scholars, but it is also known to a lot of Holocaust educators, and that is the philosopher Lawrence Langer's term choiceless choices. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Casso, if you can describe the work, and here I have this fantastic book in those nightmarish days that you published, the ghetto reportage of Peretz Zapoczynski from the Warsaw Ghetto and Joseph Zelkovich from the Lodz Ghetto. If we can maybe find a couple of highlights that would be a good example, that would be able to demonstrate what choiceless choices actually meant, this oxymoronic paradoxical term.
Yeah, first of all, I think you asked me in the email to prepare an answer about the general issue of Jewish leadership and then how Zapoczynski and Zelkovich would have seen it. And of course, to answer that, you have to understand that the people like Zapoczynski and Zelkovich were writing in Jewish time and in Jewish space. They were writing from within the event. They didn't know what we know, and what they were writing about Jewish leadership was very much determined by the point at which they were writing and the information that was at their disposal. Any judgment about Jewish leadership has to begin from the realization that there were enormous differences between ghettos. The Warsaw Ghetto and the Lodz Ghetto are only 60 miles apart, but they could have been different planets apart in terms of their internal life. The reportage of an Zapoczynski dealing with the House committees dealing with smuggling, dealing with the rich associational life of the Warsaw Ghetto would have been totally irrelevant to the Lodz Ghetto, which was much more regimented and which had an entirely different internal ghetto organization. The ghetto leadership in the Warsaw Ghetto was much more laissez-faire, you might say, than the authoritarian leadership of the Lodz Ghetto. The general problem of judging the actions of the Judenretter, and here I'll shift focus momentarily to judging the actions of the Judenretter after the war, is that we should obviously avoid the mistakes that a Hannah Arendt made, to be judgmental at the same time, not being able to read Hebrew sources or Yiddish sources, not approaching the problem from the point of view of the historian. And many of the misconceptions and the errant judgments of Hannah Arendt were corrected by Isaiah Trunk in his monumental book Judenrat in 1972, which mentions the difference between cooperation and collaboration. Judenretter cooperated because they had to, but they didn't collaborate. And Trunk reminds us that most survivors after the war, when asked about what they thought about their Jewish councils, most survivors had a mildly to a strongly positive view, especially when if they were talking about the first Judenrat, the first Jewish councils that were chosen by the Germans and were often murdered and then succeeded by a second or a third. To judge what Jewish leaders did or did not do, now we understand that some Jewish leaders were partially successful, but only if they were dealing with non-German actors. People like Wilhelm Fildermann in Bucharest was not dealing with the SS, he was dealing with Antonescu. And he had a certain measure of success in modifying the Romanian persecution of the Jews and in convincing Antonescu to allow Jews to return to Romania from Transnistria. It's possible, there's some dispute about this, it's possible that Dovber Weissmandel, Rabbi Weissmandel, had some success, or so he thought, in dealing with the Slovaks up to a point. But the Jewish leaders in areas, especially occupied Poland, occupied Lithuania, where the Germans were very much in charge, they might enjoy limited success up to a point, not realizing that in the final analysis, it was the SS that made the real decisions. So you could say that a Gens, Jacob Gens in the Vilna Ghetto, a Ephraim Baruch in the Bialystok Ghetto were quote unquote successful in undertaking measures to lower the mortality rate, to improve sanitation, to improve rations. They were quote unquote successful in dealing with Germans and Lithuanians who they thought had power, not realizing that in the ultimate analysis, the last decision would be made by the SS. You might say that Rumkowski was successful by his lights in his strategy of playing for time. How would we have judged Rumkowski had the bomb killed Hitler on July 20th, 1944, and there still would have been 70,000 Jews in the Lodz Ghetto? So these judgments are very, very difficult. I just want to add a personal note that my grandfather was on a Judenrat in a very, very small town, a very small shtetl in the Vilna area. And the Judenrat that he was on did exactly what Hannah Arendt said that the Judenretter should have done. That is, when they realized that the Germans were about to liquidate the ghetto the next day, they told all the Jews to run, to scatter, to try to go into the woods, to save themselves. And the Judenrat, including himself, they all stayed behind, basically committed suicide by burning the ghetto, hoping to give the Jews a chance to escape. This saved basically no Jews whatsoever. That action was totally futile. Any of the Jews who ran and got through the German cordon simply went into a second ghetto, accepting a German offer of amnesty 5 or 10 days later, when they realized that there was no hope of surviving on your own in the middle of 1942. So the issue of judging the actions of the Judenrat is a very fraught and complicated one. Now, finally, your question, what would Zelkovich or Opaczynski have thought about the Judenrat? Certainly, on the one hand, both would have condemned what they thought was the moral corruption of the Judenrat, although Opaczynski was much freer to write about this than Zelkovich, because Opaczynski was writing for the Einik Shabbos. Zelkovich was writing for an archive that was much less of a clandestine archive. So Zelkovich had to engage in some degree of self-censorship. Both were very disappointed at what they condemned: the favoritism, the cronyism, the moral obtuseness of the Judenräte. Opaczynski certainly would have condemned the Warsaw Ghetto Judenrat for what he believed was its tendency to favor Polish speakers and assimilated Jews. But what really matters here, what's really striking, is that when Zelkovich is describing that terrible sperre, that terrible lockdown in the Lodz Ghetto in September 1942, when everybody had to stay in their quote unquote apartments and wait for the Germans to come and take away their children and take away old people and do a selection. And Zelkovich describes how the Jewish police participated in this roundup, knowing that their children would be saved, and how other Jews participated in the roundup, knowing how their children would be saved. Zelkovich tempers his condemnation of the Jewish police. He tempers his condemnation of Rumkowski because he doesn't have any alternative to suggest. He's not saying, well, we should have resisted. He's not saying we should have gone into the streets with hammers and boiling water and attacked the Germans with our fists. He himself said that he stood paralyzed, waiting for the roundup to take place. He himself basically intimated that Rumkowski was following the only course of action that was possible. So Zelkovich's real-time reportage really underscores what Langer calls these choiceless choices. And even a month before the final deportation to Auschwitz, Zelkovich has joined a delegation of writers asking Rumkowski to exempt writers from the deportations to Chelmno, which were taking place in June 1944, knowing that any writer who was taken off the list would be replaced by another Jew.
Thank you, Dr. Casso. I could only wish that the time would be 3 p.m. Eastern time, and that we will have 90 more minutes for a whole long list of other questions that I had for you, but they would probably have to wait for another conversation. I was so curious to also learn about your own individual journeys and how you came to do your research, which is a question that both scholars and especially graduate students, and at the Fish Center, we already have a group of graduate students would be so interested at. This is the time to take some questions from our audience. There's one question. It's actually a comment, but I will rephrase it as a question from a friend of mine, Mr. Steve Rasek, whose mother Dora survived Auschwitz, who wants to suggest that perhaps the term Holocaust is what leads to the confusion when we think about the Holocaust as the victimization of both Jews and non-Jews, and that if we Jews should perhaps adhere to Shoah and Churban, as terms that would be, I think, clearer to the Jewish people, and perhaps could help us avoid the universalization, perhaps the dilution of the study of the Holocaust. If anyone wants to respond. Sam? Please unmute yourself if anyone would like to respond to this comment. No responses? Okay, maybe we will get to it. Yes.
It's
Sorry.
well, if we're chatting amongst ourselves, absolutely. But if we are speaking and writing for a larger world, which is also non-Jewish, then first we have to educate that larger world to that terminology, which in many corners is already present. The term Shoah, for example, or Churban. But that would be that would be a prelude or part of the process of trying to substitute that word for the word Holocaust.
Okay, that's one fair suggestion. Josh?
I would only second what was just said, which is that the Holocaust really is a universally understood term to mean the destruction of European Jewry during the Second World War. And so I'm not sure that an internal Hebrew Jewish term would in any way help disseminate knowledge about that event. So just as we were hearing before, so if it's for an internal discussion of Jewry, yes, that would make sense. But the word Holocaust seems to be the universally accepted word. So I'm not sure if that could be shifted or changed.
I know that the hour is late, and I'll just make one very brief comment.
Yes, please.
I would say even internally, this is a major, major question. And the question is, to what extent internally is the Shoah part of a continuum of Jewish tragedy that begins with the Churban, classically the destructions of the two temples, in which case commemoration of the Holocaust belongs as part of a commemoration of a long line of Jewish tragedies that began with the Churban, and therefore the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, might be the time, because it's really all one long line. Or Churban is actually inappropriate because we want to separate what happened in the Shoah, in the Holocaust, in World War II, from what happened before, and claim that this is utterly unprecedented, and therefore, in terms of commemoration, requires its own separate day, namely Yom HaShoah. So I'm suggesting that even internally, we're now raising a major, major issue that in fact has been the source of great debate. And the practical difference is, as I'm trying to describe, how is it commemorated? Is it part of a Churban, a long continuum, or is it something separate? I would say personally, it's something separate. I would be opposed to calling it Churban because I believe that it does merit its own separate designation.
Thank you, Rabbi Schachter. Thank you. We have so many great questions. Perhaps we can go full circle to Rabbanit Farbstein. I know that this is a late time of the night. In Israel, it's already 11:30. Rabbanit Farbstein, your English is great. If you want to respond, you can respond in Hebrew. I wanted to ask you about the extent to which your work changed the common perception of the role of rabbis during the Holocaust. I have to say that growing up in the secular part of Israel, there was a common perception. I heard it many times that it was the Zionist, the secular Zionist, particularly the labor movement, that was fighting, stayed there to fight, whereas there were rabbis who abandoned their congregants and left. Of course, a very sensitive subject. And I know, Rabbanit Farbstein, that your research shed so much light about showing the extent to which that statement is incorrect. I was thinking maybe you would want to say something about that, about the role of rabbis. Yeah. And you have to unmute yourself. Please unmute. We can't hear you. Yes.
As you said, it's a long and complicated issue, but I'll try to say a few sentences. First of all, the facts. You can open every ISKCO book. There are hundreds or more. There are thousands of names of communities in Bik'at HaKeilot Yad Vashem. And you can see where were the rabbis. They were there. You can see a lot of writing about them, short and long, and of course in Warsaw Ghetto. So first of all, most of them stayed there because they want or because they had to, because they didn't have any chance, but they were there. And in some of my papers, one is the first chapter of Hidden Thunder. I tried to prove through documents that the rabbis were the first to get the information about the killings of the Jews in Vilna, in Lodz, in Kovno, and so first of all, they were there. About those who left the Holocaust, we have to make a differentiation between the rabbis who left in the 40s or those who left in 43 or 44. And what did they know? What was their situation? Did they really run away, or maybe they have other thoughts about going out of occupied Europe? I can't say one answer. I just want to say that we have to learn every story or every event by itself and look inside it in the context of the time, in the context of the place, and so on. For example, I think that the story of the Belzer Rebbe, that this is, the extreme debate between researchers, between the newspapers, between teachers, and so on. And I think that people mixed, people didn't put attention to the date when he left Hungary. And I think that they make a mixing between him and Kastner about saying that or not saying that to the Jews who were there. And I think that people didn't notice that for 3 years he were in Poland. He were with his community. He went from place to place, and he was a leader in any place he came to. So these few months in Hungary, it was after 4 years of Holocaust. And even then, even there, we have to look in the context and in the text. And I try to put text for the readers, just to read it again and think about it. Most of the people that ask me again and again, every year around Yom HaShoah, okay, can you speak about the rabbis who left occupied Poland? And I always answer, can I speak about Rabbi who stayed there? Okay, because I thought you can read it in my book. I can answer you shortly, but it's not shortly because every one of them is, a private event.
We have to study each of them in its own merit. Well, that's a great way to conclude our program. It's 4:33, and in being respectful of your time, I wanted to first of all thank our terrific group of panelists joining us from the United States and from Israel. Let me briefly thank Chavi Dreyfus, Rabbanit Esther Farbstein, David Fishman, Gershon Greenberg, Josh Karlip, Sam Kassau, Jacob J. Schachter, Ori Scholtes, and Josh Zimmerman. I also wanted to thank our audience, those who joined us today, and to encourage you to go to our YouTube channel and to watch the lectures. They're going to be stored there in perpetuity. To thank our coordinator, our terrific coordinator, Hodaya Blau, who put together this entire series, handled all the logistics and delivered all of this on time. And to also thank our student, Lois Roman, who was helping her. Next year, we are planning to launch the sequel to Jewish Responses to the Holocaust and focus on the responses that came after 1945. Last but not least, Mr. Emil Fish, if I would ask you to turn on your camera, that would be an opportunity for all of you to wave to you and to thank you for the incredible gift that you made to Yeshiva University that facilitated the foundation of the Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, whose aim is to train the next generation of civic leaders, professional leaders, and teachers in the field of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. So we make sure that what happened during the Holocaust will never be forgotten or repeated. I wanted to thank all of you for being with us today, and stay tuned for more programs. Thank you.